played, diced and raced, shouting jokes in the sharp, slanting dialects of the north. My eyes were heavy in my head, and my arm ached from the morning's exertion. I sat beneath the scrubby shade of an olive tree to stare out over the ocean's waves. No one spoke to me. I was easy to ignore. It was not so very different from home, really. The next day was the same. A morning of weary exercises, and then long afternoon hours alone. At night, the moon slivered smaller and smaller. I stared until I could see it, even when I closed my eyes, the yellow curve bright against the dark of my eyelids. I hoped that it might keep the visions of the boy at bay. Our goddess of the moon is gifted with magic, with power over the dead. She could banish the dreams if she wished. She did not. The boy came, night after night, with his staring eyes and splintered skull. Sometimes he turned and showed me the hole in his head, where the soft mass of his brain hung loose. Sometimes he reached for me. I would wake, choking on my horror, and stare at the darkness until dawn. Chapter 4. Meals in the vaulted dining hall were my only relief. There the walls did not seem to press in on me so much, and the dust from the courtyard did not clog in my throat. The buzz of constant voices eased as mouths were stuffed full. I could sit with my food alone and breathe again. It was the only time I saw Achilles. His days were separate, princely, filled with duties we had no part of. But he took each meal with us, circulating among the tables. In the huge hall, his beauty shone like a flame, vital and bright, drawing my eye against my will. His mouth was a plump bow, his nose an aristocratic arrow. When he was seated, his limbs did not skew as mine did, but arranged themselves with perfect grace, as if for a sculptor. Perhaps most remarkable was his unself-consciousness. He did not preen or pout as other handsome children did. Indeed, he seemed utterly unaware of his effect on the boys around him, though how he was I could not imagine. They crowded him like dogs in their eagerness, tongues lolling. I watched all of this from my place at a corner table, bread crumpled in my fist. The keen edge of my envy was like flint, a spark away from fire. On one of these days, he sat closer to me than usual, only a table distant. His dusty feet scuffed against the flagstones as he ate. They were not cracked and calloused as mine were, but pink and sweetly brown beneath the dirt. Prince, I sneered inside my head. He turned, as if he had heard me. For a second, our eyes held, and I felt a shock run through me. I jerked my gaze away and busied myself with my bread. My cheeks were hot, and my skin prickled, as if before a storm. When at last I ventured to look up again, he had turned back to his table and was speaking to the other boys. After that, I was craftier with my observation, kept my head down and my eyes ready to leap away, but he was craftier still. At least once at dinner, he would turn and catch me before I could feign indifference. Those seconds, half seconds, that the line of our gaze connected, were the only moment in my day that I felt anything at all. The sudden swoop of my stomach, the coursing anger. I was like a fish eyeing the hook. In the fourth week of my exile, I walked into the dining hall to find him at the table where I always sat. My table, as I had come to think of it, since few others chose to share it with me. Now, because of him, the benches were full of jostling boys. I froze, caught between flight and fury. Anger won. This was mine, and he would not push me from it, no matter how many boys he brought. I sat at the last empty space, my shoulders tensed as if for a fight. Across the table, the boys postured and prattled about a spear and a bird that had died on the beach in the spring races. I did not hear them. His presence was like a stone in my shoe, impossible to ignore. His skin was the color of just pressed olive oil and smooth as polished wood, without the scabs and blemishes that covered the rest of us. Dinner finished, and the plates were cleared. A harvest moon, full and orange, hung in the dusk beyond the dining room's windows. Yet Achilles lingered. Absently, he pushed the hair from his eyes. It had grown longer over the weeks I had been here. He reached for a bowl on the table that held figs, and gathered several in his hands. With a toss of his wrist, he flicked the figs into the air. 1, 2, 3, juggling them so lightly that their delicate skins did not bruise. He added a fourth, then a fifth. The boys hooted and clapped. More. The fruits flew, colours blurring, so fast they seemed not to touch his hands, to tumble of their own accord. Juggling was a trick of low mummers and beggars, but he made it something else. A living pattern painted on the air, so beautiful even I could not pretend disinterest. His gaze, which had been following the circling fruit, flickered to mine. I did not have time to look away before he said, softly but distinctly, "Catch." A fig leapt from the pattern in a graceful arc towards me. It fell into the cup of my palms, soft and slightly warm. I was aware of the boys cheering. One by one, Achilles caught the remaining fruits, returned them to the table with a performer's flourish, except for the last, which he ate, the dark flesh parting to pink seeds under his teeth. The fruit was perfectly ripe, the juice brimming. Without thinking, I brought the one he had thrown me to my lips. Its burst of grainy sweetness filled my mouth. The skin was downy on my tongue. I had loved figs, once. He stood, and the boys chorused their farewells. I thought he might look at me again, but he only turned and vanished back to his room on the other side of the palace. The next day, Peleus returned to the palace, and I was brought before him in his throne room, smoky and sharp from a yew wood fire. Duly, I knelt, saluted, received his famously charitable smile. Patroclus, I told him when he asked. I was almost accustomed to it now, the bareness of my name without my father's behind it. Peleus nodded. He seemed old to me, bent over, but he was no more than 50, my father's age. He did not look like a man who could have conquered a goddess, or produced such a child as Achilles.
You are here because you killed the boy. You understand this?
This was the cruelty of adults. Do you understand? Yes, I told him. I could have told him more, of the dreams that left me bleary and bloodshot, the almost screams that scraped my throat as I swallowed them down, the way the stars turned and turned through the night above my unsleeping eyes.
You are welcome here. You may still make a good man.
He meant it as comfort. Later that day, perhaps from him, perhaps from a listening servant, the boys learned at last of the reason for my exile. I should have expected it. I had heard them gossip of others often enough. Rumors were the only coin the boys had to trade in. Still, it took me by surprise to see the sudden change in them, the fear and fascination blooming on their faces as I passed. Now even the boldest of them would whisper a prayer if he brushed against me. Bad luck could be caught, and the Erinyes, our hissing spirits of vengeance, were not always particular. The boys watched from a safe distance, enthralled. Will they drink his blood, do you think? Their whispers choked me, turned the food in my mouth to ash. I pushed away my plate and sought out corners and spare halls where I might sit undisturbed, except for the occasional passing servant. My narrow world narrowed further, to the cracks in the floor, the carved whorls in the stone walls. They rasped softly as I traced them with my fingertip. I heard you were here. A clear voice, like ice-melted streams. My head jerked up. I was in a storeroom, my knees against my chest, wedged between jars of thick-pressed olive oil. I had been dreaming myself a fish, silvered by sun as it leapt from the sea. The waves dissolved, became amphorae.
Calvin. Hey, Calvin.
What?
Do you ever get really weird dreams from Hindu mythology?
No.
You don't? Oh, I fell asleep next to you and I had such weird dreams.
Oh.
They're even like really hard to explain, but I just know that they were about Hindu mythology.
Well, that's weird.
Yeah. I think it's because I kept on waking up like halfway, and then the guy's voice would keep on talking while I'm like half awake, half asleep. I want to hear a philosopher.
Whoa.
I asked Professor Richard Wolff today why hyperinflation happened in Venezuela and what America had to do with it.